What is up, folks? You're with Budgetmonk, and welcome to the first episode of my new Holy Roman Empire guide, The Shadow Kingdom. I am going to cut to the chase and actually skip through taking monarch points from the estates and hiring advisors and such, and we're going to get straight into the good stuff, which of course, as Austria, is diplomacy. Throughout the course of this game as Austria, our diplomacy is going to be completely nebulous. We may have some powerful allies to deter nations from attacking inside the empire. However, for the most part, we're actually going to be switching our alliances to nations who are rivaling our enemies, respectively. Now, the focus of this first episode is going to be the Shadow Kingdom, and I am going to be allying nations who are rivaling the Pope and or desire their land, as well as other nations who are rivaling Venice. Now, as you can see, I have allied Provence and Milan, and the reason is because these nations can be called in offensive wars by promising them land, as Provence desires Avignon from the Papal State and Milan desires Brescia from Venice. I did decide to also ally Bohemia for the future, as he's also rivaling Poland, which I intend to set my sights towards. Now, you'll notice, if you're paying attention, that I'm being very meticulous here with my diplomats, and I do actually want, as each month ticks over, to actually be improving upon a spy network. I wanted to talk really briefly about the Shadow Kingdom in general. Of course, we're trying to own the Papal State's land in central Italy, as well as Venice's land, with the exception of their capital in the area of Venetia, in order to pass the decision reign in northern Italy. When they first introduced this decision, I realized that it was in fact doable, but there are some massive issues that we're going to encounter. And usually, by taking such a large area of land in terms of development, it's going to not allow you to do much else within that period of time, only things which do not actually acquire aggressive expansion. And therefore, it was quite debatable whether it was worth doing at all, as it does consume most of your time and priorities for the first 50 years or so. Now, I did make quite some bold claims in the introduction of this video, and I'm going to be showcasing innovation here in the first episode, which is going to be a reoccurring theme throughout the series, but it's actually going to enable us to almost entirely circumvent aggressive expansion, for example, and therefore go straight into war again and use our time extremely productively. And of course, it's also going to allow us to circumvent being excommunicated, which is a huge issue in the beginning of the game. But with no more further ado, let's begin our first war. Now, you can see here that I really lucked out in regards to the Papal State's allies, and I'm calling in Ferrara, who actually desires his land, as well as, of course, Provence. Now, I do want to talk about the fact that this is basically a free win over here with the Papal State. What you guys are going to most likely find is that you actually have to deal with Aragon most of the time. I don't want to hear complaining about this, as I did this start over and over and over again many times. It is definitely doable. In fact, I've actually defeated the Papal State while being allied to France, which is basically the worst case scenario among realistic scenarios. Austria is an absolute powerhouse in terms of your forces, as well as your moral of armies in the beginning of the game, which these nations do not have. The recommended approach that I have for Aragon is actually to use length of war and defeating him in battles, as well as eventually taking Naples and sieging down Naples for some war score to actually just simply peace him out. So my approach would actually be to focus on the Papal State. It's important to note that Avignon is actually not garrisoned, it's not maintained, it's garrisoned in the beginning of the game, which means you can take that with relative ease. And it's also important to note that you have very strong defensive forts to be fighting on. If Aragon basically just goes for the base race approach, you can hopefully take a fort and then group up and just go attack him while he's sieging down your forts in the mountains. It's also very likely that Florence will be helping you against the Pope statistically, and his capital in the hills there is a good location to actually take defensive battles. With those things being said, I definitely want you guys who are actually trying to simulate this, to have the mentality that everything that's going down throughout the series is going down throughout the early game. And obviously having that dream scenario of the early revoke being an absolute monstrosity is going to make the mid and late game somewhat trivial. So this game is all about the early game. So please don't get too worked up on if you feel like it's not so easy, because you're going to have to work here in the beginning of the game, and that means really showing your military prowess as the nation of Austria if that is what is required. Another thing that I want you guys to be aware of, which should not come as a surprise, is that right now it's very likely that Burgundy will actually attack Provence. So with that in mind, typically he actually waits for France to dishonor his alliance or guarantee via the Surrender of Maine event, which bogs France down in a war and therefore dishonors the call. Now what he will do if you're actually running thin fighting your long war is he will actually attack them, and this is somewhat expected. It's not that big of a deal. You actually don't need Provence to be participating theoretically. It just allows you to actually return the core of Avignon to him without actually costing you Diplo points. So my recommendation is to actually break your alliance with Provence as soon as this war is over, and if he is actually attacked by Burgundy, believe it or not, I suggest as your course of action you should actually dishonor the call. And if worst case scenario Provence is actually separate pieced, then your solution is going to be to return the core to him anyway, but that will of course cost Diplo points. Now, as this war wraps up, you're about to see what that innovation actually is, and that is to hand off the Papal States provinces entirely to my allies and friends. Moreover, the provinces which we actually desire to be inside the empire, we're going to be giving to our small Italian friends inside of the empire. And of course, by doing this, therefore, we circumvent the aggressive expansion, we circumvent the hostile relations with the Pope, and therefore, as he is the courier controller, he's not going to excommunicate us. And of course, our little friends will add these provinces as they're small nations. We have high relations with them. Once they've cored them up, they're going to add them to the empire. I think that we illustrated the new innovation there fairly well, and I do actually hope that you guys gain some kind of entertainment value from these videos as well as improving your game. And therefore, I'm going to go ahead and do a bit of a speeding montage here where I actually show you guys the kind of force comparisons before I declare the wars, and I'll probably show you the end results and the approach that you should actually be taking to piecing these nations out. Notice that Venice has a little bit of a trade league here, as well as being allied to Genoa, and we're going to be brute forcing him as Austria with only the help of Milan. So like I said, definitely going to be saddling up to some hardcore wars here in the beginning of the game, and perhaps wearing that manpower thin. I will actually be making jump cuts after this war is over to where my truces are up, and each of these wars which are actually relevant pertaining to the Shadow Kingdom event, and I hope you guys enjoy. Notice how I'm actually using claims in Istria and Dalmatia as opposed to the priority provinces. This is quite possibly the most satisfying thing ever, as I am going to be handing these provinces off to Milan and splitting this nation between the two of us. Unfortunately, in this first war, he's actually occupied by Serbia, I believe, in an alternative war, so that will have to wait till later, but mission successful here, as we do now have 2 out of the 4 provinces conquered via handing them off to Milan. Jumping forwards here about a decade, going into our second war against the Papal State and our third war total in our Italian campaign. I've definitely been getting up to a lot of other things within that period of time, but you have to make sure to stay tuned to the series and tune into another episode if you want to actually see what those moves entail. As far as this war is concerned, this is probably the most simple out of the 3, as the Papal State is in a weakened state, and his ally of the Palatinate is who I first focused on to separate peace. Pretty straightforward, giving Ferrara 2 additional provinces. However, of course, I will be leaving Roma itself intact for our third war, where we will go in and be taking that ourselves, as we do not need to core that up, but simply pass the decision in order to add it into the empire. Jumping ahead in time once again into our second war against Venice. He was actually allied to the Papal State this time around, which is a little bit awkward because I didn't want to take him out as a non-co-belligerent, and I couldn't make him co-belligerent as I had a truce with him. However, white piecing was not that much of an issue in that sense. I had plenty of time to actually reign in northern Italy. I do want to talk about the fact that I'm able to take Istria here, which is an state that I own, and complete the process of giving his provinces to Milan. I also want to talk about the fact that we've been handing off so many provinces to our little Italian friends here. They actually are becoming fairly empowered and also have a ton of favors to help us with just about all the wars that we're fighting. As for our final war against the papacy in order to add Roma into the empire, his diplomacy was actually the strongest. Being a one province minor, he had actually joined a trade league. He actually had extremely strong diplomacy, and this was by far the most difficult Italian war, ironically enough. Just to be clear here, guys, I did have to use the age bonus to make claims off of neighboring claims in order to actually claim Roma, as at this point, because I've been feeding my allies, I do not own a bordering province. As well as the conventional form of trouble, fighting a large defensive alliance, I did actually run into trouble here at this stage, as the papacy, his alliance, was actually able to separate piece Ferrara. But of course Ferrara owned tons of the Papal States core, and therefore he did actually expand himself. However, naturally he was massively below 100% war score cost, and I was actually able to 100% him nonetheless by returning core to Ferrara in that case, and taking Roma myself. I should mention that you can see Ferrara owns Abruzzi here. I simply fed him that because I had the opportunity to do so, and he added an additional province into the empire. It's not actually a necessity to own that province in order to reign in northern Italy, but speaking of which, here is our moment to reign in northern Italy. In 1481, with 9 years to spare, but of course I probably could have done it even earlier. The main impressive fact or feat of this is that I've been so productive elsewhere, but that's for another episode. Naturally, I will be reinstating Roma when the event occurs to actually reinstate it or take massive penalties with Catholics, as you can see here. And that's actually it for this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed this new format, and make sure to stay tuned for episode 2 and so on. Thank you very much for watching. I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons, guys. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you next time.